Good afternoon, and thank you for taking some time to go over Windows 10 deployment best practices using Altiris. I'd like to thank everybody for your time this afternoon, and we're going to be focused on some of the things that are surrounding Windows 10 migrations. As many of you are aware, the end of life is coming up, or end of support is coming up for Windows 7 very soon. And there are still yet many organizations that need to roll out their Windows 10 to their production environments. And so today we're going to talk about several topics surrounding that in terms of addressing how to dispose of assets, how to look at your software packaging, prioritizing, scheduling, and many of the other processes that will make for a successful presentation. We have two presenters today, Paul Manfredi and Mohammed Abdelnabi. Both of them have been doing migrations and deployments with Altiris for the better part of 20 years. And so they've certainly learned a lot of tips and tricks over that time, and they're going to be sharing with you some of their knowledge. I appreciate your time and attention to this. And again, if during the presentation you have questions, feel free to shoot them over in the chat window, and I'll try to insert them into the conversation if it makes sense, or hold them for the end if they're particularly lengthy. With that, I don't want to waste any of our precious time. So Paul, if you'd like to introduce yourself to the group and go ahead and start making your presentation.
Great, thank you, Mike. Thanks for the intro. I just wanted to welcome everyone, and again, echo Mike's thoughts on, appreciate the time you took this morning out of your schedules to join us in today's discussion. The goal of today's webinar is to provide you with the best practices overview when planning your upgrade to Windows 10 computers in your environment using Symantec's IT management suite, the Altiris platform, for those of you familiar with it. I'm going to present the project approach that we typically follow when conducting a migration to Windows 10, and some of the different options available to you, and some of the important details around each that'll help shape your decision on which approach to take in your environment. Then I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Mohammed, and Mohammed's going to discuss best practices around software packaging and deployment options, prioritizing your list of software, and some of those main software installs when upgrading from your current Windows 7 environment to Windows 10. As always, I'd like to make this presentation as interactive as possible, and I always welcome your input, but again, in the interest of time management, we're going to save the questions until the end of the presentation. And at that point, we'll open up the floor for Q&A and open discussion. All right. I'd like to start again by introducing myself. For those of you that don't know me and haven't followed any of our webinars, my name is Paul Manfredi, and I'm a senior systems engineer here at Intuitive in the professional services group. And I'm based out of Los Angeles with account coverage nationwide. I've been working with Altiris and now the Symantec suite since late 2006, and have been part of Intuitive since early 2012. I'm a certified Altiris engineer and instructor going back to the 6.0 days. My main area of focus is the Endpoint management suite with a specialization in ITMS and asset management implementations. So a lot of experience around upgrading, implementing, working, building projects out of the business requirements stretching back to Windows 2000. Mohammed, if you wouldn't mind, would you like a quick intro of yourself before we move on?
Yes, thank you, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Mohammed Abdelnabi. I'm also a senior system engineer at Intuitive. Unlike Paul, however, I'm based out of a much colder place, which is Omaha, Nebraska. I've been an Altiris admin / engineer / architect for more than 12 years. I'm a certified Altiris engineer in every Altiris version going back all the way to version 6. I also have 12 plus years of experience of managing Symantec help desk and then service desk products. And last but not least, I have about 8 years experience in Symantec workflow. During my 12 plus years journey with Altiris, I manage small to large organizations, anywhere from 1,000 to 50,000 plus nodes with a mix of Windows and Mac endpoints. Those environments were in the media, public education, and manufacturing sectors. So that's pretty much kind of a quick intro about me. Mike, would you like to give a quick intro of Intuitive Technology Group and just give us kind of a quick overview?
Absolutely. Intuitive Technology Group has been around since, since the early days of Altiris. In fact, my experience, I was employee number 33 at Altiris back in the late 90s. So I've certainly been around this platform and have done many implementations as well. As Intuitive has grown, we've also grown, and at this point, we actually represent the entire portfolio of Symantec products, as well as doing consulting on DevOps, Lean Agile, security, and big data, all of which seem to somehow tie in with any sort of infrastructure project that involves the Altiris platform. So it's been a real treat to work with folks such as Mohammed and Paul over the years and see the great projects they've done and participate where I can. But certainly from from Intuitive's perspective, having the capability to not only work with you on some of these critical end user initiatives, but having the ability to also talk about the impact to your overall security posture, to your business process, and all of those types of things really help increase the value and tie all of what we're talking about today into the larger picture of how can my organization run better, faster, leaner, and ultimately more profitably for all my stakeholders. So with that, back to the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Just a quick overview on our presentation agenda for today. So I'm going to walk us through the approach to Windows 10 migration projects. So we're going to talk about the strategy and our overall overarching approach to how we tackle a Windows 10 migration project. Then we're going to look at the individual strategies, in particular, in-place upgrade versus reimaging, user profile migrations, how we tackle hardware-independent imaging for diverse hardware types in our environment. And then Mohammed's going to look and talk about software migration in the environment as it pertains to our migration, and things like prioritizing our application environment, and then testing application compatibility. All right, with that said, we'll take a look at the features. Let's run through a quick overview of some of the key features of Altiris and the deployment solution in particular, and the benefits of using it to complete a Windows 10 migration. So, along with being able to provide the tools to migrate the operating system to the latest version of Windows, deployment solution also gives us the ability to migrate user data, personality settings, and of course OS and application settings to the new operating system. This can either be in the form of an in-place upgrade, a wipe and reload of the existing hardware, or replacement of the new hardware scenario. Each one of those scenarios is covered. So everything from the user's wallpaper to personalized printers, any local data, as well as operating system settings that are specific to the user can be harvested using that tool set and are a critical part of the migration process. It also gives the administrator the ability to configure each system on a standardized criteria such as job function, user type, or physical location. So I can build an image deployment job specific to the call center department, for example, or different geographical regions where the base image is the same, but specific operating system settings, for example, language, data, currency, and so on, are set specific for each region where I deploy. You can also change basic system and network settings during the deployment job. For example, with a task, you can specify the computer name, join it to a specific domain, and provide it with specific network IP range, for example. The real value in the tool can be summed by its ability to reduce the downtime of the client by leveraging the efficiencies of both automated and repeatable deployment tasks. So our migration project challenges. So before diving into the Windows migration project steps, I just wanted to frame the project conversation with the different groups that'll view the project. Managing expectations of the various stakeholders is a critical part of any project, and the main stakeholders during a migration group, from our experience, can be broken down into these three groups. So first, the direct consumer of the service that the migration is benefiting, obviously the end user. The end user's concerns will focus around the final result of the migration. This is the operational result of our test plan and migration procedure. Planning and a constant stream of communication is very important during the migration in order to minimize the potential for failure and to properly level set what is being delivered as opposed to any end user assumptions. So providing a detailed project migration schedule, immediate post-migration support and training are key aspects to that adoption of the new operating system and its ultimate success. In the middle here, we have the next stakeholder group, and arguably the most important, the project sponsor. So your C-level executives will need a very different set of information than the end users. We typically make sure that we're prepared not only with the technical implementation plan, but a financial breakdown of costs aligned with a schedule of the implementation timeline, taking into account various business-specific constraints which may affect the implementation plan, and accurate time estimates of how long each computer being migrated will be out of service or unusable. And then lastly is the IT department's view of the project. These will be very technical in nature, and we're all familiar with them to a degree, being technical ourselves. So items like ensuring that the implementation plan being proposed is technically feasible in the environment and will not adversely affect any production aspects of the business. So that one's specific to and very technical in nature. Okay, migration considerations. So along those same lines of project management, we want to ensure that the project planning is thorough. Using these four pillars as the guidelines for the migration are our cornerstones for helping and facilitating the planning phase. So first is communication. We'll build a project communication plan and stick to it, or at least make sure any changes are recorded in there. This should include weekly project status calls, bi-weekly project reviews with the project sponsor, keeping the team and the stakeholders informed of the progress and status of any changes to timelines, etc. is absolutely critical here. Next up is making sure, setting expectations, making sure we clearly define our objectives of the migration. And if they change even slightly, be sure to update the team. So we set achievable goals here, conduct time estimates of the effort involved to migrate one computer, for example, and assign our resources accordingly in the migration schedule. An important point here is not to overstretch the migration team or underestimate the efforts involved in the migration. So we want to ensure the end user is aware of their scheduled date and the timing for the migration of their specific machine and or machines in their department, those sorts of things. Next up, opportunities. So if we're conducting a wipe and reimage approach to the migration, we put the time into building a standardized environment. The time invested always pays dividends over the lifespan of the computers being migrated through reduced service management requests and increased efficiencies. So the more standard our environment can be, the better it is for us long term. We make every effort to harvest and consolidate software licenses during this phase. This is the perfect time to take control of that license entitlement and compliance in your environment. And lastly, focus. We need to avoid being pulled into side projects that come up as a result of the migration activities. Be sure that the end users and stakeholders understand the boundary of the migration and what is included as part of the migration budget. So prioritizing the easier business lines to get off to a good start is always a key here, and establish some quick wins always helps the project move along smoothly at the outset. Becoming bogged down in the more complicated business line migrations early on can create that perception of a mismanaged project. So we typically will start off with the easier departments and move forward from there. Okay, let's take a look at project milestones. So here's an overview of the 7 key features or milestones that make up one of our Windows 10 projects. So our approach to that Windows 10 migration will share these fundamental steps that the previous operating system migrations followed to ensure that successful outcome that we're looking for. So the introduction of the Windows as a Service model has changed the way we need to approach the post-migration day-to-day management and updates, things like maintenance, that now follow that new servicing model introduced by Microsoft with that initial Windows 10 release. And we discussed details of that in an earlier webinar that if you need access to, please just send me an email regarding. So when we approach that Windows 10 migration project, we use that breakdown of those 7 essential steps. And let's take a look at each one of those in a little more depth. So the first one here is our environment assessment. So the environment assessment is the first step in the migration. It answers the critical questions like how many computers will need to be replaced under Windows 10, or how many copies of AutoCAD do we have installed versus the number of purchased licenses we own. We begin to collect both the hardware and software inventories from the environment and begin analyzing those results. So this is the point we also meet with the various lines of business that have specialty hardware, software, in order to reassess their needs going forward. We determine the hardware readiness of the environment to create the possible scenarios for upgrade. For example, the numbers of computers that can be migrated to Windows 10 with an in-place upgrade versus the number that will need additional hardware for the upgrade, the number of machines that will need to be replaced, those sorts of metrics. So then after meeting with those business lines in the environment, we build a list of applications that will need to be supported in the Windows 10 desktop environment, and prioritization of those that Mohammed will get into a little bit later on here. Prioritization of that list to make sure that build, migration, and test plan is accommodated for each of them. So once we've got that gathered information around the hardware, we know the effort that's required going forward with the migration, along with the software application migration plans. Then it's time to evaluate the costs associated with getting it done. We need to remember to be mindful of the internal SLAs to the business lines and re-examine our project plan one more time, looking at it specifically for risks related to the project deliverables. Okay, so the hardware readiness assessment, let's take a closer look here. There are several tools that we can leverage to assist with the hardware readiness of the computers that we're looking to migrate. This will help us with the key decisions that need to be made early on during the budgetary planning portions of the environment assessment. Namely, how much it'll cost to upgrade the required hardware. Once that hardware assessment is complete, we can determine the quantity of computers that meet the requirements for Windows 10 as is versus where we'll need to upgrade. How many will require cost-effective upgrades such as RAM, hard disk replacement, and how many will actually need to be fully replaced as part of the migration activities. So the two main tools that we typically use during our migration are the custom reports that we'll craft out of the Symantec Management Console. And this report will typically list out the computers in the environment, detailing things like OS, service pack, as well as the necessary hardware metrics needed to judge whether or not to upgrade or replace it as part of the Windows 10 project. And the second tool we'll use as a benchmark there is the Microsoft Assessment Scan tool, which will provide similar information to the console. And this is just essentially to validate our data. Okay, moving on to software readiness. This is going to be a very similar exercise to the hardware assessment. We'll begin by collecting the breakdown of computers by OS in our environment. And those metrics will be key early on to help determine the overall complexity of the migration. So understanding what software packages are most widely used in the environment is very helpful here. Again, it's important to build the priority listing of the software that will become part of our Windows 10 platform based not only on the sheer number of installs, but more importantly on the criticality of the software from a business perspective. So you want to make sure that when meeting with the lines of business that a metric to track is the importance of the software being collected. So determine if any data resides on the user's system, home directories, browser favorites, etc. Agree on a policy for responsibility related to that user data residing on the user's computers and assist where appropriate. Again, for software assessment, we primarily rely on SMP console reports, so reports coming out of the Altiris console. That data source primarily made up of installed software in the environment. This can be coupled with application metering to build intelligence into the report to tell us if and when that software was last used. So if we need to run with a decision point around whether or not it's going to make it to the user's newly migrated machine or not, those metrics help us there. Okay, the next step is that Windows 10 build. So the most efficient way to tackle this is by making a hardware independent image. So this type of image will be universally used across all of our platform types, all of our hardware platform types. And there's a specified point during that imaging process where the drivers needed by that particular model type will be injected. Again, that's a topic that we've covered in an earlier webinar. So again, if you need help getting to that, we have it up on YouTube. Feel free. I'll have my email address up at the end of the presentation. Just shoot me a quick email and I'll direct you there to the link. So once that hardware independent image has been created, it'll need to be tested against the hardware types that we're targeting for migration in the environment. Essentially here, you'll end up with a model-specific directory structure for your hardware types, which will contain all of the needed drivers for those machine types. And then during the imaging process, after the base image has been copied to the target system, we run in the form of a VB script, a task that's used to determine that specific model type and inject those drivers into the machine's image. So after you've certified that the imaging process is functioning against all of the supported hardware models, you'll need to determine which software applications to include in the base image as opposed to which ones will be delivered through software delivery policies after the system has been imaged. Typically, we keep the image, the base image, as lean as possible, adding only security type applications like endpoint protection and a clean Symantec management agent install. So here's a graphic that helps us explain the hardware independent imaging model and how it works. So the hardware independent images enable the organization to capture one operating system image and later deploy that same image to multiple machine types across the org. So many organizations would previously have had, multiple operating system images captured for each unique type. So we eliminate that with this approach. It takes on an exponential amount of effort, and compared with the hardware independent images we use in ITMS. The hardware independent OS deployment solutions have also existed in previous versions. However, we have, with the later versions of Altiris, we have driver tagging, so we can be more precise in our control of which drivers are installed for a given model. And that hardware tagging was specifically developed to address the needs of the newer UEFI devices that have increasingly unique and challenging driver requirements. Okay, software application preparation. So the next step here in our migration project is preparing the software applications. So this can be done particularly, it can be a particularly difficult phase to manage depending on the number of applications currently running in the environment. So we tend to take a holistic approach when looking at the software apps and how they'll impact the Windows 10 migration project. So defining a scope of applications will be included as part of the migration is key and one of the first steps we follow. It's an important prerequisite. An important prerequisite to this step is having that complete listing of all software currently installed. So leveraging our software inventory. Again, this can be based on metering and software inventory reports. These reports will provide us those important metrics on not only the software titles, but more importantly, if and when they're being used. And aggregating that data and having it be part of our initial meetings with the various business lines to discuss their core apps and how they relate to the migration are key to our project success. So once we have the definitive list of software needed in the environment, we'll need to ensure that the versions are supported by Windows 10. So depending on those results and findings, you may need to upgrade some of the existing software app versions prior to our migration or as part of it. Again, this will need to be tackled on an individual software application basis, taking into account factors like cost of the application, criticality of the application to the business, possibility of replacing the application with a different one, etc. So there's a lot of moving parts, a lot to think about here when it comes to the roadmap for software applications in the environment when moving to that new OS. So after the list of apps has been defined, a test plan should be built to ensure that all those apps will play nice together. We typically build out a plan based on lines of business and the software apps needed by each of them. Once those compatibility tests are complete, we'll start with the repackaging activities of those software apps so they're ready to be used as software delivery tasks or policies, I should say. And appending those to our imaging job during the migration process. So by the end of this phase, all your in-scope software applications should be fully tested, repackaged, and ready to be added to those policies as part of the imaging process. So once that's done, our next step is going to be user data and profile migration. So that information from the user's existing system is going to be a large part of the migration. This step will not need to be performed where you're conducting an in-place upgrade, as it will keep all those settings as part of the upgrade process. However, it will need to be done when moving to a different system as part of migration. So again, here, the deployment solution lets us capture all of the user's profile and settings from their system, which we call the user's computer personality, as a pre-imaging task. Information like those individual files and folders kept locally, application menu bars, desktop settings, control panel, network properties are also available to be captured. So the built-in feature we used here is called PC Transplant, and that's available as part of the ITMS suite. And using it, we're able to generate a template, and that template will define the information that will be captured in that personality package. This task can then be integrated into our re-imaging job, letting us both automate the capture of the personality and then the restoring of that personality during that re-imaging process back to the new system. So because of the amount and type of data that can be harvested during this portion of the process, the amount of data can vary considerably between users. So here we like to make sure we clearly define and communicate what exactly will be included as part of that personality capture process. One caveat to keep in mind here when using PC Transplant is when you use a built-in job to capture that personality to the local site server, it's going to go to its local site server. We typically configure it to copy those personalities to a centralized location instead to minimize those bandwidth considerations. Again, this will depend entirely on your environment. All right, next step here, automate that migration process. So once we've got the build complete and the specific tasks we've looked at for the migration, it's time to assemble them into an imaging job in the management console. So systems that have been identified for migration, any required hardware upgrades that have been completed on them, PC Transplant, all the software applications that have all been ready and tested. Here I recommend a build schedule be created ahead of time. This schedule would list not only the target migration date, user sign-off, completed system migration, but also an area where you could track the installation status of any hardware prerequisites. So a listing of the software apps needed, as well as details around any user-specific data capture requirements for PC Transplant. That schedule would also list the user's department, specific imaging job used during that migration also. So once we have those aspects defined, we're able to assemble a tailored imaging job in the console. And we typically create specific jobs based on one or more common criteria. As I mentioned earlier, for example, the department being migrated. This way, all of the common features can be targeted to a specific group of systems. For example, the finance department will have software apps which are specific to their department. So finance specific imaging job that will include those installation tasks and specific apps. So moving through your migration project by department is probably the easiest and most streamlined approach. And that's post-test and piloting out to each of the environments. This is really only specific to once we get into the production phase of the migration. One point also worth mentioning here is the phased approach, which should be followed. Like any project, you'll want to pilot this out to the newly migrated machines in a pilot environment with a few prearranged users from each department, and work closely with them to fine-tune that final imaging job before you roll it out to the full migration. So again, here at the end of this project phase, your image is assembled, automated, ready to be tested, and that complete imaging job is ready for migration. And again, here the next step, so performing the actual migration. I mean, now that those imaging jobs are automated and assembled, this is the first phase of testing should be in place and completed. It should encompass a mock migration using that build process that we talked about, at least one system from each department. So any and all issues you run into should be documented, remediated before going further. So once that test phase is signed off and complete, our scheduled pilot system should be done next. Remember, this is a few selected users from each department. You'll need the resulting feedback before going forward to the production phase. So after that pilot deployment is complete, we typically let the users take at least 1 or 2 weeks of usage with the new systems and gather feedback during that time. Once that feedback is collected, we make any minor changes to it. Again, here we leverage a migration schedule based on departments. And this information is then filtered and becomes part of those various project status reports that we run up the chain. And that leads us into reporting on success. So as I mentioned earlier, that second group of stakeholders here are most, in tune with the budgetary aspects. So a key aspect to a successful migration for us is the ability to report and measure on progress. Being able to identify the total number of migrated systems based on a migration schedule here is essential, with details like end user, department, type of migration, if the system was replaced, upgraded, etc. The planned migration, the actual migration date is also helpful to determine if our project is trending close to initial estimates or if we're drifting. We can also gain visibility into any unforeseen problems that need to be reported immediately during the migration. So team members will need to track an issue, escalate if necessary, and if it can't be remediated during the migration. So here we leverage both console reports and the migration plan, tracking spreadsheets, for example, as a source of metrics to provide management with project status calls. These should be updated at least weekly or bi-weekly, if not daily, during those production phases of the deployment. That project sponsor confidence needs to be maintained, and it's the best way to do that, in my opinion, is with those positive metrics. So that's an overview on the migration steps of the project. I'm going to pass the presentation over to Mohammed now, where he'll go through some of the finer points around software applications and the strategies involved. Thanks for your time. Mohammed, if you'd like to take over, I can pass you remote control of this.
Yeah, go ahead, Paul. I'll share my screen.
Presentation, or you can share out your screen at this slide. It's completely up to you.
All right, I'll share my screen. Just give me 1 second.
Thank you.
Let's see here. All right, can you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
Oh, hold on. There we go.
Yep, there you are. It's all yours.
All right, awesome. All right, thank you, Paul. Again, my name is Mohammed Abdel Nabi, and I will be sharing some of the practices that would help you plan a successful migration. Imagine you just bought a new house or moving to a new apartment. You will start by developing your moving plan, or aka migration. You would be contemplating things like, when should I start the move? Do I move over the weekends, after work, or do I take some time off work to complete the move? Do I have friends and or family members willing to help with the move? Can I complete the move within the allotted time frame with the resources that I have? Should I hire movers for my stuff, or should I rent a U-Haul and just move everything myself? So once your game plan is executed, congratulations on completing your move to the new place. Well, not quite yet. I hate to be a downer, but let's talk about all those little boxes that moved with you from the old place. So let's talk about the boxing strategies for a minute. Some people will take the needed time before the move to package and label every box in a way that all what they have to do when they move to the new place is unbox and everything is good to go. Others may have a limited time and or helpers to accomplish the same setup before the move. In that case, they will package and label a lot of their boxes, but it may not be as accurate as the first scenario. For instance, boxes labeled dining room may contain items that belongs in a kitchen, but they're okay dealing with a few misplaced items when they start the unboxing at the new place. Now, think of if they are very restricted on time and or resources. In that case, they may just make sure to package and label the things that they would need moment one they move into the new place, or things of high value. For instance, packaging and labeling boxes that contain kitchen, toiletries, antiques and collectibles that cost a lot of money if lost or damaged, and for the sake of the new neighbors, some clothes. Everything else goes into semi-random boxes that may or may not be labeled, and they will then deal with it once they move into the new place. Once the move into the new place has been completed. Now, think about those 3 boxing scenarios / strategies as you start planning your software migration. Just like the move into the new place, you will find out that dealing with your boxes, aka software packages, will consume a lot of your time. This is true whether you do the work before or after the move, aka the migration. All right, so let's talk about prioritizing your applications. We'll look at the what, the who, and when. The what is going to be your first step. Your first step would be to inventory the environment and collect all used applications. Once the list is compiled, then you can, with the help of the stakeholders, determine what needs to be moved to the new environment. Not every piece of software on that list may need to be moved over. Some legacy software may no longer be used or have been replaced by different titles. This would actually be a great time to start cleaning up your software catalog in Altiris, or at least start planning the cleanup since you already have the list of used applications. Moving on to the who. This is one of the most crucial steps of the whole process. Knowing who's using the application would help you prioritize your packaging and testing strategies. For instance, applications used by the financial department may be needed immediately after the migration due to the end of quarter or the end of the year tax preparations, or a software that is used by a senior director that is planning on a presentation to the board of directors in the very near future. The when/how often is being used, it should not come as a surprise that when surveying end users, almost everyone will try to convince you that their applications they use are the most important in the whole company. The most asked questions I experience in performing migrations are, what happens to my files, and when will my applications continue to work after the upgrade? Let's say you interviewed someone in the advertisement department. He or she would tell you that a non-functioning software will cost the company money. Therefore, they should be on top of the priority list. However, being armed with the knowledge that the software in question is only used once a quarter, you can maybe move it to number 10 on the list. Just remember, everyone will be trying to present the best case for winning that highly coveted number 1 spot on your list. All right, so how to gather applications. This step, along with what is being used in the environment from the last slide, will consume most of the timeline assigned to the application migration. This is due to the amount of data that need to be collected and analyzed. So how do you gather application usage? The two methods I will discuss today are Altiris and surveying application owners. If you are using Altiris, then you already have one of the best/most powerful tools out there for gathering this kind of information. Application metering is going to be one of your best tools in your belt for this job. What I'm going to tell you is this: if you take only one thing from today's webinar, it should be deploying application metering in your environments. This would have many benefits beyond just application usage monitoring. This will save your organization a ridiculous amount of money due to what you can achieve with software licensing utilization. The benefits of application metering can be a whole webinar in its own, but for the sake of the topic at hand, I would only speak of application usage monitoring. Application metering would allow you to gather information like when an application was used, how long it was used for, who used it, and on which computer. That kind of data would play a big role in determining which applications should make it to the top of your list. There are some out-of-the-box reports in Altiris that would show some of that data. However, more powerful reports can be custom designed. For instance, custom report with username, computer name, and application usage filtered by computers that are not Windows 10 compatible can be designed. You can then take that report and talk with the end users and determine if those applications will still be needed in the new environment. Another report can show data related to applications that are still being used but no longer have a licensing agreement. Those applications can be removed from the list of software titles that need to be tested. Another option is to survey the application owners. This approach would take significantly longer and would require a dedicated resource to the project. For this kind of a task, a business analyst is typically required. Also, keep in mind that usage data will be purely based on the end user's perception. In other words, you have no way of verifying if the user truly used the application daily or once a quarter. Keep in mind that regardless of which method you use, one of the end goals should be reducing the amount of software that needs to be tested and coming up with the most accurate list as much as you can. just like moving out of your old place, no need to spend valuable time boxing unwanted things just so you can get rid of it once you arrive at the new place. Okay, so moving to testing applications compatibility. So again, going back to the new house / department analogy, your strategy will depend on how many applications you have, how fast is the implementation, and the confidence level required. In the most comprehensive approach, you will test, repackage, and set up user acceptance testing for every application you have on the list. This approach is favorable if you don't have too many applications or if you have a very relaxed / extended time frame. The pros of doing that is once you're at the new place, aka Windows 10, you already know everything has been tested and good to go. Cons of that is that this may require a long time to set up and a lot of dedicated resources that you may not have. In the least comprehensive approach, you should at least test all the critical applications and verify functionality with application owners. You can then start working on readying the top 25 to 50 most used applications. Use this approach if you have way too many applications with an aggressive migration time frame, or if you have limited resources that can help with the testing and packaging process. Pros, I would say your pre-migration time would be significantly reduced, and you may not require as many dedicated resources as the first approach. Cons to that is increased workload post-migration and very fast turn time when it comes to fixing broken applications. You also may not have enough resources to keep up with the demands. All right, so application testing environments. What is the best approach to package testing? I typically break my testing into 3 phases. In phase 1, I manually install the software on 2 of my testing VMs. One is set up with Windows 7 and the other one with Windows 10. I observe the installation and record all the expected behaviors. In phase 2, I package the installers along with any command lines that are required for the installation. I then deploy the newly packaged software via Altiris to 2 different Windows 7 and Windows 10 machines than the ones that were used in phase 1. And finally, I verify the installation and make sure it completed successfully and that the application functioned as intended. Watch out for per user installations. Those are a little bit tricky. Those would require extra attention because typically the system account is used by Altiris when deploying applications. And if the installer or the installation is user-based, all the needed files would be under the system account profile. Odds are users will not have access to that profile. Depending on your environment's security practices, you may or may not be able to run the installer as the logged in user. For instance, if the user does not have local admin in their machine, so the installation will fail at that point. In that case, more engineering would be required to resolve the challenge. In phase 3, I deploy the packages to a test machine that would be used by the application owner. I typically like to have the application owner test on a non-production machine. That way it does not affect their workstation in any way. Also, they can still perform their job while testing. Now, depending on if user acceptance testing was part of the plan, I have the application owner sign off and accept the package at that phase as well. All right, so a couple final thoughts I would share on that as well. Windows 7 end of support. So the lease on your old place is set to expire on January 14th, 2020. And that's basically end of support date for Windows 7. Unless if you're willing to pay an exorbitant amount of money, aka extended support to Microsoft, your move need to be completed before that date. Why pay for the extended support? Well, you know that the migration will have to happen regardless at one point. I believe you would be better served spending that money on maybe adding a few more resources to support the migration plan. Migration aggressiveness, consider factors like how many computers need to be migrated, how many applications need to be tested and ready, what's the rollout plan, does the environment have freeze periods, is the deployment taking place during or after business hours or on the weekends, when will the migration start, how many departments or endpoints are getting migrated in each wave. Available resources, think about the available resources, stuff like bandwidth, IP leases, hourly versus salaried employees dedicated to the project, overtime pay, after hours and weekends availability, and skill sets. All these things will play a big role in your plan. And finally, I would say be honest. Be honest with your leadership team. If they set an accelerated migration timeline, just be empowered to present them with your best educated advice on what will be needed to meet that timeline. I have seen it many times where a whole plan fell apart because some team members were worried about speaking their minds and oversold the migration plan. All right, that's pretty much it for my part. I would pass it back to Paul. Paul, if you want to go through the last few slides. Again, thank you for your time, and my email is in the slides, or if you have any questions, please feel free to email me directly or just send them in the chat.
Thanks, Mohammed. I just put these last couple of slides in here, really just to plant a seed around the asset recovery and disposal processes as they relate to a project migration. I know we're coming up here at the end of the hour, but some ideas around here are leveraging asset management post-migration or during the migration to give us that visibility. As Mohammed had mentioned, things like software harvesting by leveraging things like application metering and extending that out a little bit to put some real numbers around, how many copies of, whatever, Visio, for example, do I really have to true up on? What machines are coming due for end of lease? Am I still, going to need these machines as part of the migration process or not? So there's the retirement activities. And then the last piece was really those retirement or the disposal portion around getting those machines off our books and into the recycler's hands, and the chain of custody involved with that. At the tail end of those, migration activities. So, ensuring that a box with our asset tag doesn't end up in an eBay auction, and making sure those machines are written down as far as from a financial point of view, from the finance platform, and certification around those disposal activities. So they're just things to keep in mind that I thought we should throw a couple of slides in here at the end to talk about and just give you the thought to put those on your roadmap also. So if anyone has any questions regarding follow-ups or assessment of your environment, we do offer that initial imaging and environment assessment at no charge, where we'll just do a WebEx and go through your environment real quick for you to look at your standing and how you're ready for your next upgrade. So with that said, I will pass it back to Mike. Again, I thank everyone for their time, and that's it. Hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. We had a few good questions, and so first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance today. I know we went over by just a couple of minutes. For those of you who would like to stick around for the Q&A portion, we'll go through it. We probably have about 5 or 10 minutes worth of questions. For those who don't, we will be sending a follow-up recording of this so that you'll have a chance to review it at your leisure. So with that, Paul, some of the questions that came in were regarding the communications, and I know that you spent a little time on that at the beginning, but really I know from my perspective, that's really been one of the bigger determining factors of success or failure for the migrations, given the fact that there are always going to be some technical nits that pop up along the way. The communication and keeping that cadence going is really critical. So I was glad to see these questions. The first one is, what's the typical cadence of communication for each of the various stakeholders? Specifically, how much warning is the end user given? How many reminders before the migration? And even when does the migration take place, during the day, during the weekend, etc.? And what follow-up mechanisms do you typically put in place?
So that's a great question. And when I had mentioned the communication plan, I typically detail each one of those schedules in the communication plan. So there's, I'll list out each and every one of those communication-based items and the cadence for each, and where it fits into the migration process itself. So some of them are based on operational schedules. Some of them are based on, just keeping the entire team up to speed. But again, those are all fit into the communication plan.
Okay. A follow-up question that I thought was interesting was, what level of detail do you disclose to the end user? And I know from my own experience, it seems to vary by client, but what have you generally seen as a rule of thumb on the level of detail that gets disclosed to the end user about what's happening? How much of the sausage recipe do you give them?
Yeah, that sort of excuse me, that sort of information really is come to it's based on a discussion with the client. I typically start at a very general point. The machine's going to be upgraded. Here's what's going to look like afterwards. A short document with reference, some small reference pieces. No impact is going to be, seen as part of it. All applications will continue to run, but that's usually the start point. If anything further is required, then we'll document that. But that's typically where we start as a guideline, and then internal politics and procedures will dictate from there.
Okay, great. So then one last question that came up on the communication plan is, what about any special reporting or dashboards or things along those lines? How much, I guess my own 2 cents on this is, how much of that are just using notification policies to shoot out pre-canned reports or custom reports from the NS versus using a Tableau or using spreadsheets, or what sorts of things have you seen from various clients in different migrations?
So if there's an opportunity to leverage a big data reporting platform like Tableau, great. Each data source that we can leverage, and if they're existing, fantastic. If they're on the roadmap already, then let's try to use them. But we have our set of custom-built reports that we'll bring into the environment and import into the existing notification server environment, along with, as I mentioned, the Microsoft tool sets.
Beautiful. So we also got a couple of in the weeds sort of questions. One of them is, do you use deploy anywhere within, which is obviously part of the deployments solution as well as Go Solution Suite, in the process of doing your hardware independent imaging? And I know for my purposes, I certainly have used it in the past. I prefer not to, and prefer to use the script and the layered folders with, organized by model and OS type. But Paul and Mohammed, what about you guys? Do you use it, and under what circumstances?
Yeah, I mean, I'll let Mohammed answer also, but I typically use the deploy anywhere less and less now, where I'll go with more of a scripted approach, using something like a double driver freeware, where I build out that structure of drivers based on each model type.
Okay, Mohammed, any thoughts?
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. I couldn't get out of the screen. Yeah, typically when I used it, I used the script method. It was just a little bit easier, and it was much faster when you're doing the update, when you're updating your master list of drivers. It was just a matter of grabbing the new drivers, putting it in the shared folder in the network share, and just you really didn't have to do anything other than that. Using deploy anywhere, then you'll have to go get the files, load them up to the notification server, waiting for the whole database to the driver database to update and whatnot. And sometimes that may take a long time, and sometimes the outcome is not 100% predictable. So I always use the script approach.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's precisely it. It's being able to get a predictable outcome, less time. And you also brought up one other handy thing that I've used in the past, and I've seen others do successfully, is to create a package on the NS with all the drivers so that it replicates out to all the package servers, and thus is conveniently close to whatever the machines are that are going to be migrated. So just a couple of thoughts on, again, digging into the weeds. Another question that came in on that same vein was, what are some of the key differences in deploying a Windows 7 image and a Windows 10 image? And I know for my purposes, it's very similar, but if either of you two would like to weigh in on some of the differences you see between them, if any.
Go ahead, Mohammed. I don't see anything that jumps out at me in the structure or the approach between Windows 10 and Windows 7. I think it's more related to the types of hardware that we're encountering now with UEFI and Secure Boot.
Yeah, the short answer is no. The more detailed answer, I would say, it depends what you want to do with the Windows 10. As Paul mentioned, the Secure Boot and whatnot. Some of the clients that we work with, they think it's a great time when they're migrating from Windows 7 to Windows 10 to start leveraging some of the Secure Boot and the UEFI features of the new BIOS. So part of the Windows 10 deploy job is a task to upgrade the BIOS to support those new features. Your biggest thing, however, I would say would not be the deploy, it would be the capture. Capturing Windows 10 is a whole different beast than Windows 7. There is a lot of, prepping steps that needs to be done to capture a successful image that can be deployed to different computers. And I believe, Paul, if I'm not mistaken, that was discussed in some of the previous webinars that was presented by Intuitive.
Yes, that's right.
It's probably in our YouTube channel as well.
Yeah, it should be covered.
Those are all great points, and I would concur. I think it is definitely are you doing a legacy Pixie boot? Are you doing the UFI? If you're doing the secure boot, if you're looking at encrypting, it's more additional steps and addressing those. And yes, I think is a great final comment would be that we do have a YouTube channel. We'll mention that in our follow-up as well, and we have a number of webinars across many different topics, including Altiris and DLP and CASB and proxy and web isolation and many other great topics that would be part of a day-to-day discussion within IT as well as within the security departments of your organization. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your time. Thank you for your questions. Again, if you do need additional advice or just want to bend our ear from a technical perspective for an hour or two, we'd be happy to engage with you on that. And otherwise, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.